healthy doesn't mean much anymore. It can mean about anything depending on what somebody wants to defend or invest in. So that became a very impoverished, and we want to make it richer again by bringing it back to nourishment. And you find that the people that eat in the healthiest way, so the people that are also usually, people that are better off, better educated and so on. So you're capturing an association that is telling you that the healthier, richer, middle-class people have less disease and eat more or less of specific foods. But the causal link between that is very tricky. For instance, if you look at the pure cohort, so any change you're going to make, and that's something we shouldn't forget, that if we change something else has to come in its place. And there's certain margin for change, clearly, but a radical change where you just take out everything and you just assume that you'll be able to compensate that by growing more crops is something we have to really carefully evaluate.
In this episode of Tomorrow's Bites, we bring Frédéric Leroy, professor at the University of Brussels, and we talk about the future of food systems, explore the challenges of the dietary guidelines, the rise of the ultra-processed food, and the sustainability within the animal-based diets. Frédéric shares key insights on prioritizing nourishment, addressing global dietary shifts, and fostering evidence-based food policies. And now we move to the episode. Well, first of all, Frédéric, thanks a lot for coming to the podcast. It's an honor that you come here and you come to share your expertise and your knowledge and your background. We are really pleased that you are here. And the first question that we make to all the guests is quite similar, but I think it's just fair for the audience to know you better. And the question is simple, or maybe not, but who are you and what mission are you on?
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for having me today. And so I'm a professor at the University of Brussels, and I have expertise in a number of things, and I try to combine them around food and nutrition and food processing. And my background is rather complicated. I don't know if you want to hear the details, but I combine somehow.
I have a question about it, so we can just go forward and you can tell us. No. Tell us about your background, because it's not as straightforward. It's many.
Because absolutely, yes. So my background originally is in bioengineering. I did a master's in bioengineering, but bioengineering is a very broad umbrella, at least in Belgium. So it encompasses all sorts of studies from the environmental perspective to cellular biology to chemistry and food biotechnology and so on and so on. So within that study, I picked the direction of chemistry, and within chemistry, then ultimately did a master thesis on nutrition, human nutrition, on the food security in an African context. And after that, I started a PhD in a different domain, which was food processing, food fermentation, and very often also taking case studies focusing my case studies on animal source foods. So I also became a bit of a generalist within the domain of animal source foods. And then I became interested in the societal aspects of animal production and what that means for nutrition, but also for sustainability. And
I wonder, how did you get excited for this? Like, when there was the moment you're like, wow, this is even a more interesting field, so I have to step into that.
Right. Okay. Well, I just, originally I started this, my study or my research based on funding. There was funding from a European project, and it looked into the safety and quality of fermented meat products at the time. And so it could have been anything else. But I started with this. And then, of course, if you study something, you need to know also where it's coming from and how it's produced. And I digged into all of that. And around the year 2015, 16, 17, things became much more controversial related to meat. In the beginning, it was just an ordinary food as many others. But then around 2015, the conversation changed. Maybe partially because in 2015, also the WHO report on meat and cancer was published. So that could have played a bit, but many other things were going on. And that incited me also to start some interdisciplinary research together with people from the humanities and all sorts of other disciplines to better understand why my case study became so controversial. Because that really happened very quickly, and a lot of what was being said was contradicting what I knew about meat and meat production. So I felt that it was my academic responsibility to step in and try to correct some of those messages. But I just also found it fascinating, the way that food is mobilized to express identity. It's a very emotional conversation, very clearly. So there's more going on than just a factual discussion on nutrition, health, chronic disease, environment, and all of that. So it's probably also because it involves the killing of animals and the ethical conversations around animal killing.
I'm just thinking that your journey is really a vision of how important is curiosity in the researcher's perspective, because I really see that you are in a topic, you move to the next topic, and there's always a kind of what are the aspects that you believe that make a good researcher?
Well, I think, first of all, is especially today, we see that a lot of what is being claimed and stated in newspapers and social media, but also sometimes by scientists, is not very well supported by evidence. And that is, I think, because one of the main tasks for a researcher is to have sufficiently high standards of evidence. Now, you can claim anything. You can claim anything about any food or about anything else out there. You will always find a study. You will always find an argument. But in the end, you have to build a case based on the totality of the evidence, and especially by respecting standards of evidence. I think a lot of the discussion nowadays, especially in the food system space, should be based on standards of evidence. And that, I think, is what characterizes a good researcher. But what does that mean? It means respecting the methodologies. It also means that if you are going to develop scenarios, virtual assumptions, where you kind of model what the future should look like, then such modeling always rests on premises, and those premises need to be solid. And if they're not solid, that's fair enough. You can go for such an exercise, but you have to acknowledge your limitations. And probably, I think, a lot of the conversation nowadays is not sufficiently attentive to the weaknesses and limitations of the premises.
And it is like, I can go into the science part, but I think it's more or less the bridge to...
Go on wherever you want.
Okay. So in that whole journey, like, what was then we actually didn't talk about where you're now focusing on, right?
Yes. Well, I have a combination of my research is focusing largely on the expertise I built up since my PhD research, which means food processing and especially food fermentation. So there's a lot of work on fermentation, not necessarily animal source foods. You work on pulses and cereals and all sorts of other things. And that's microbiology, but it also is, chemical, because we need to look at metabolites and we look at conversion processes. So that's very much food processing, food technology. And then I have still my interdisciplinary research that is now running on the topic of discourse, how discourse related to dietary guidelines has evolved over decades, all the way back to the early 20th century or even before that, and how we can find patterns within patterns of change and why that could be, how that could be explained. And then I'm involved related to this also. I'm looking at new possible ways of designing dietary guidance.
Why?
By introducing a kind of paradigm shift in the way we define what is proper nutrition. We can go into this at some point if you want to in the details, but that's more.
I think that is one of the main topics of discussion. He shared a really interesting article that is going to be published officially in February, if I'm right, February 2025.
Right. Yes, February. So yes, first step, and so we've this is a longer process, but this is a first attempt to schematize and to summarize the discussion. And so that's an attempt that consists of bringing together people with different expertise. And so so the authorship consists of, myself, of course, I've led the initiative, but we also have people that are specialized in food history, evidence-based medicine, clinical nutrition, epidemiology, food security. And by balancing those views, we come to kind of, new approach to feeding human populations with a particular focus on the concept of nourishment. And the reason for that, and let me maybe already give a bit of details here, is that a lot is being claimed on healthy diets. I mean, people talk a lot about healthy diets, but we've been talking so much about healthy diets that we've lost meaning. Healthy doesn't mean much anymore. It can mean about anything depending on what somebody wants to defend or invest in. So that became a very impoverished, and we want to make it richer again by bringing it back to nourishment. And nourishment re-emphasizes the need for essential nutrients. So that has been the beginning of dietary guidance. Originally when they discovered vitamins and minerals, people wanted to make sure that there's enough micronutrients available within diets and populations. And then we kind of lost track of that, and we assumed that everything is fine. And the focus shifted to chronic disease. And ever since, the guidelines have been focusing on chronic disease got worse. And meanwhile, we not only see a rise in obesity and in cardiometabolic diseases, but at the same time, we also see an increase in micronutrient deficiencies. So we overeat, but at the same time, we undereat. And that's where we find the opportunity to talk about nourishment, because nourishment is making sure that you have quality food that replenishes your needs and your requirements and meets your requirements, but at the same time also makes sure that you have more robust dietary patterns. And that has to do with, or that at least also brings in the importance of commensality, eating together, traditional diets, having closer and richer relationship with food. Because we've outsourced too much of that knowledge to calculations and epidemiological associations, but in the end, we forgot how to eat properly.
So that's you gave a reason which, you didn't actually, you explained the dietary guidelines eventually were focusing on solving chronic diseases or focusing on that, but they eventually became worse. Then my question is what has changed that make this worse?
How that happened?
How did it happen?
Well, we don't know. I think one of the reasons is that the evidence is using low certainty. So the guidelines are based on low certainty evidence. So that's one thing. So we've mobilized information that is not robustly grounded in empirical data. So a lot of it is just speculative. We have seen it with the insistence on dietary fat. There was a very strong insistence on dietary fat, and then they found out that actually that wasn't a very good idea. After the low fat craze was emerged in the 1980s, people started to understand, well, fat is quite important. Okay, we can talk about quality of fat, but we were very quickly going to overstated assumptions and evidence. That's one thing. And then secondly, it's the models that have been proposed are very narrow. We have very narrow approaches to what a healthy diet should look like. It is mostly based on a certain interpretation of the Mediterranean diet. Now, the Mediterranean diet comes in all shades and flavors and kinds, but there's one interpretation that is mostly US-centric ideas of how Mediterranean people are supposed to eat, and that has been the model for global advice. And sometimes they change that a bit, but it essentially always comes down to certain elements that are promoted in the Mediterranean diet. And then whether or not those guidelines give you a proper diet that is healthy is something that comes with its own discussions. I mean, it may as well be a perfectly healthy diet, but it may not be the best diet for everyone. And it's certainly not always in tune with local resources, local needs, cultural appropriateness, and metabolic differences between people. But regardless, I think probably the major problem is that when those guidelines were formulated, a new model, a new business model developed, which was extremely reductionist. Some people talk about nutritionism, where certain, like for instance, the focus on fat resulted in the low fat products. Was a whole wave of engineering going on to meet the criteria imposed by the dietary guidelines. Take out sugar, take out fat, add fiber. But by doing so, food was modified so extensively that the processing levels were ramped up, and we ended up with ultra-processed diets. And besides that, producers also discovered that ultra-processed foods just sell very well because they are, quasi-addictive. They lead to overeating. People like them a lot. And the ultra-processed food model emerged a few decades ago. And probably the main reason why things are going in the wrong direction is because of the emergence of the ultra-processed food culture. The dietary guidelines may have steered that to some degree, but of course there's more going on. It's also, it has also its own dynamic.
Yeah. So basically, like, I have here the guidelines of the Netherlands in front of me. So if I go through it, like, eat lots of fruits and vegetables, consume mainly whole grain products, such as whole grain bread, whatever. Eat less meat, more plant-based food, and vary in fish, pulses, nuts, eggs, and vegetarian products. Consume daily sufficient dairy products. Eat a handful of unsalted nuts daily. Consume soft and liquid spreadable fats and cooking fats. Drink sufficient amount of tap water, tea, and coffee. If you go through this, like, what can be still be on this list following your expertise, and what should be different? What should we differently in? What should we change?
Okay, so the model that we are proposing is throwing out everything that is not based on robust evidence. How do you define robust evidence? Well, one way to look at this is using assessments of certainty, right? You have in evidence-based medicine, at some point in time, they introduced the grade system. Now, the grade system has been introduced because there was a lot being claimed in medicine that was not really evidence-based. It was based on weak evidence. And the grade system cleaned out field by imposing certain standards. And those standards have to do with the strength of the associations, dose response. And so, there's certain, like the Bradford Hill criteria, you have certain elements in place to judge if something is strong or weaker evidence. Now, they have applied the grade system to nutrition as well, and they're increasingly doing so. And there's no reason why not to do so, because it's a health discipline like all the others. Only in nutrition, the problem is that the studies usually will give you low certainty evidence. And that's because of the nature of the studies. It's very difficult to obtain higher certainty levels because you have to follow people, and there's a lot of confounding taking place. And you can do intervention trials, but then, of course, they're short term. You have to work with proxies or with markers rather than with outcomes. So it's not easy, and we're stuck with low certainty evidence. Now, some people will claim, like Harvard's Walter Willett, for instance, will claim, well, it's weak evidence, so we have to lower the standards of evidence, and we just go and give that advice anyway. Other people, like Gordon Guyatt, for instance, who's one of the developers of the grade system, will be saying, no, we cannot water down the evidence barriers because, it's epistemologically not the fair thing to do, and it's not appropriate. And that's a clash that we have now in the nutritional domain.
Yeah, but then
go ahead.
Why is nobody asking then eventually because, there are reasons why we cannot do strongly evidence, right? Like, for instance, within food, it's not very ethical to follow someone and give a very strict diet to see a certain effect. So the problem lays a bit before, right? It is not like the outcome and then compare those two and then see like what we can use for dietary outcomes. It's mainly like, but there's very strict rules around like dietary interventions and all these things. Do we need to tackle that?
You mean to relax the
criteria? Well, in the end, we walk against a wall all the time. I have a constant discussion on this because,
No, I
seems
think,
no outcome.
I think it's, of course, we have to respect ethical commissions and what is an ethical assessment of what can be done and what cannot be done. But I do think we have to, and I'm certainly not the only one thinking this, and not even the one coming up with this idea. John Ioannidis from Stanford, for instance, is a very strong promoter of just stopping to repeat again and again the same epidemiological studies that have been on, that just give you the same results all the time, and rather use all that money to be more creative and come up with new types of study. And it can be done. I mean, we can make those interventions more, or those studies more targeted to specific research questions, and have good setups and try to solve some of those problems. Because otherwise we'll just end up, generating low certainty advice, and then based on that, come up with those guidelines. Now, what we see with those guidelines, a couple of things that are always emerging is a very strong insistence that red meat is harmful and whole grains are good, right? And you find that again and again in studies, but you find them specifically in North American studies, where you work with specific populations and cohorts of people that are usually, in the health domain, and you find that the people that eat in the healthiest way, so the people that are also usually, people that are better off, better educated, and so on. So you're capturing an association that is telling you that the healthier, richer, middle-class people have less disease and eat more or less of specific foods. But the causal link between that is very tricky. For instance, if you look at the PURE cohort is one of the biggest global studies. It's over several continents. It involves many different countries. So Andrew Mente, which is one of the lead authors of the PURE studies, also was co-author on our paper. They find different associations. If you look at the global relationship, for instance, whole grain comes out as neutral, not as protective. And red meat comes out as protective, somewhat at least. The people that eat more red meat are better off. Now, on a global level, it has to do probably with the same kind of dynamics, because people that are healthier in the global south will be those people that have less of the cereal staples and more of red meat. So you're capturing again a relationship there, which is again tricky to explain in a causal manner. But it shows you that the context is extremely important. So where you measure, in which region, will determine whether it's protective, neutral, harmful, and it just reinforces the same ideas we have around food, especially because the American studies are so dominant. And then that advice gets formalized, and the people are receiving that advice eat more like this. And again, the most obedient, the most healthy people will confirm those patterns and reinforce in a positive feedback loop, always the same notions. You have examples, if you have a scientific exercise, it's always good to try and falsify something, right? By trying to find examples that do not correspond with the statement. That's how Popper developed his epistemological approach to science, right? So you falsification. Now, you do have examples of diets that are contradicting the guidelines and still result in healthy outcomes. You have people that are on low carb diets. They kind of clash with some of those guidelines. You have people that, for instance, you have indigenous people like the Maasai or the Siberian pastoral herders, the Nenets, for instance, or you have the Inuit. They eat fundamentally different than we do. And I'm not saying that everybody should follow that dietary pattern, clearly not. But they have healthy outcomes, unless, of course, we confront them with the Western diet that is based on ultra-processed foods. So from the moment we enter those indigenous communities and we bring them starches and oils and sugar, well, then they develop very quickly metabolic disease.
But is this not actually saying one thing that I think is interesting? Because we had it in this podcast, we had like the question to people, what is healthy? When they say our product is healthy or this supports a healthy diet. And the question is always, okay, but what is healthy? What does that mean? And it's always a word that maybe because it's impoverished, as you said at the beginning, it's really difficult to define. But maybe it's because healthy does not have a global meaning or a global meaningful meaning, but more like a contextual meaning. Of course, we can see that different diets around the world can be considered healthy. Still, that doesn't mean that those same diets in different areas of the world would be as healthy. That's because I was thinking when you were mentioning the cohort, like, I think it's really interesting at the level of examining what is the outcome of eating certain foods within the human body, regardless where you're from. It's really interesting because it helps to define the dose, not that Paracelsus says the poison is not the poison itself, but how much you eat of it. But at the same time, it's true, it makes sense that maybe in Western societies, we need to be careful about saying certain things are healthy because the availability of it is so big. And maybe we're talking about America and the huge meat industry that they have in there and big fast food restaurants that are all around that make, like, if you want to eat 10 burgers per less than 15 euros, it's so easy. It's crazy. And that is why I believe that it's also really where you have to be really careful when you're saying, in this case, red meat, because you mentioned, but with any other food, this is healthy because it's really a matter of in what context we are talking about,
Yes.
not like how much meat is healthy, how much fruit is healthy, how much dairy is healthy. And then there is another aspect that I would like to discuss later that is also not only what is healthy for the human body, but also what is environmentally healthy. That also is something that is necessary to take into account. But that is what, in my opinion, something that is important sometimes to understand about the concept of health.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And that's why we came up with that background exercise. If you take, for instance, red meat. Now, red meat is valuable because of all the nutrients it brings. It's a package of nutrients. At the same time, it may not be a good solution for everyone because we know that some people, there's a certain minority of people that will accumulate iron, right? Which can become toxic. So for some people, it's better to moderate red meat if you're in that kind of position. So it all depends on your individual constituency and also which alternatives you have. I mean, if you're going to drop out meat, that's perfectly achievable, but you will have to get those nutrients from other foods. So the main point we're trying to make is we don't want to direct people towards individual foods. So we leave it all open. The only thing we're saying is be sure that you're covering your nutritional needs. And that means, your protein needs, mineral and vitamins. And then the other kind of limitation we are giving is staying away from ultra processed foods. Again, not by focusing on individual foods, but on diets dominated by ultra processed foods. So we're not saying you cannot have any ultra processed food once in a while, but you should avoid because you don't have the evidence for that. But we do have the evidence to say that diets that are dominated by ultra processed foods are probably detrimental. So if you say stay away from those kind of diets and make sure that you prioritize nutrient dense foods, I think we're already saying a lot. And I think we already cover a big part of the nutritional problem. You can always, optimize in the margins, but if those two simple notions are taken up, I think we would already see a rapid improvement of the condition. And then you could go in that direction in so many different ways because the human omnivore is so flexible. So we've seen that if we just look at the diversity of traditional diets within Europe, but especially globally, there's so many ways that a human can reach adequate health or nourishment. And I think we are being very paternalistic in the way we're prescribing that. And we should just leave that an open question. So one of the things I mentioned in the paper is, albeit briefly, a reference to a study from the 1930s from Clara Davis. I don't know if you're aware of the study, but Clara Davis was a medical doctor at the time, and she experimented with a group of kids, very young children, and they were coming from deprived backgrounds. That was before the ethical commissions would step in respect to your previous comment. So she took care of those children, and she had a team, and the entire team was instructed not to interfere with the dietary perceptions or beliefs of those children. Right? They came in as blank slates, and they were offered buffets, like ad libitum food, And there was a list of, I don't know how many anymore. I think it was around 20 foods or something, or 25 foods of all different types. And they could eat whatever they wanted. And nobody was instructing them what to eat. And those kids or children managed to pick their own optimized diet in very different ways. So some of them were having very peculiar choices, like they were combining banana with liver, and they were gorging on the liver. And then they maybe never touched liver again. But maybe, they were instructed by their bodily homeostasis for vitamin A deficiency or something. They kind of managed to find in many different ways. And the paper interestingly mentions also that those ways were probably clashing, or were probably a dietitian's worst nightmare. I think the author writes it like that. But all those children thrived, to the amazement of the doctors that were supervising it. So it shows you that there's a certain degree of nutritional wisdom in the body that we also find very clearly in animal studies. Now, if you look at animal studies, the way grazers, for instance, manage to eat certain plants and then avoid them a bit later on, and then, so they manage to balance toxicity of some of those plants with nutritional value, and they navigate that very, very carefully, very precisely, and they do that just by, the nutritional wisdom that is inherent to those animals. We as humans kind of think we're special and that we're not able to do so. And I believe that we are able to do so unless we are confronted with foods that deregulate or mess up our appetite, the way we can control intake and needs. But if we avoid those foods that interfere with the way we kind of search for, what is needed in what is available, then I think we can get a long way.
And how do those foods look like that interfere?
Well, those foods so I think an important point here is that if you, and that's coming out of the animal studies as well, if you, especially for omnivores or for flexible omnivores like the human, there is a continuous processing of information based on sensory inputs, right? So we have an innate response to things that are probably good or bad for us. You can see that with babies, if you give them bitter or sweet, and then there's a learning process where continuously nutritional information that is sensed in the body, because we have receptors not only on the tongue, but throughout the whole gut, where we're tracking glutamate and, nutrient contents. We're continuously tracking nutritional input, and we're continuously coupling that with sensory information so that the body learns where the proper foods are and which ones to avoid, which ones to moderate. And that works very neatly unless you start giving people junk food. And the problem with junk food is not only the fact that it has maybe a lot of sugar and fat and so on, but it's more, I think, that with those foods, we're giving them false information. We give them false flavors, fake textures, and those give you fake information. So you're uncoupling that process. And then your body gets confused and starts eating in ways that are not appropriate anymore. By adding the vanilla and the hazelnut syrup and this fat replacer and the sweetener, you're continuously giving your mind information about nutritional biochemical content, but you're not delivering. And I think that's probably something that is playing in the background, why nutritional wisdom would be, would be dysfunctional in such a case, because we're just screwing up the flow of information between sensory inputs and nutritional biochemistry.
Is it also mainly because the matrix is just very different?
Yeah, that as well. Yeah, that's part of the whole thing. Because if you open up the matrix, because ultra processed foods, the difference with processed foods, which generally are benign, because they come with lots of advantages, ultra processed foods, they disrupt the food matrix. And that also, again, is sensed in different manners in the body. For instance, if you have very refined carbohydrate fractions, that will be picked up very differently by your incretins in the intestine, and that will give a completely different insulin response than if you have, the more balanced ticking off throughout the gut of more wholesome kind of carbohydrates. So the way we're destroying food matrices probably indeed is also a factor of importance. And then, of course, you have other things at play, like we know that there's a kind of a strong reward in combining fat and salt and sugar at the same time.
Mhm.
So those things play as well. But I generally believe the more I read about it, and especially also looking at what's coming out of the animal studies, is that sensory information is extremely important. And there's a reason why we were just spicing up everything. The body is kind of looking for stuff, and we give those different flavors, but then we're not delivering the nutrition that comes with it.
This makes me think about it. Like, I wonder until what extent of the processing there is this interference, because we could argue that smoking a salmon already affects the texture and it could confound the mind or I don't know, even in some way cooking a meat already changes the structure of it, and it's not the natural way, the man that like this animal way that a person that I don't know, the way that a lion would eat a cow is completely different than the way that a human would eat a cow.
Yeah, but it's interesting also that, in carnivores, they just pick up way less sensory information than we do, tastes, for instance. So they don't need that process all that much because it's very simple for them. You have the gazella, you don't have it's very straightforward. It's a very straightforward process. We are trapped between being a kind of being explorers of new foods and being adverse to trying new things because we know they're potentially dangerous, and we try and that's the how to call it, the paradox of the omnivore. Which we want to try out things, but we cannot just try out whatever, and we have to very carefully navigate that very dangerous space of foods that are unknown to us and work with that. Now, whatever is smoked and heated has a very long history. We don't know when fire started.
No.
And smoking, but that's probably going way into the Paleolithic. If it's 500,000 years or longer, there's some debate on that. But that goes a long way back. And to the point that it looks like our body is kind of adapted to that as well. The way we can deal with products of the Maillard reaction is quite remarkable in the human being. And we also like those, we're attracted to those smells. So something is probably already in the blueprint. Now, on the other hand, also smoking, is the phenolic compounds you have there, they're indicators also probably of, toxicity. And they could even also kind of temper your hunger and create some satiety. So things may play that we don't even know about. At the same time, if you excessively smoke and if you excessively, like with certain meat products, you have toxicity, right? So
exactly.
You have to be, but the more you're in, and I don't want to have the natural fallacy here as, or overstating the natural fallacy, but there is something safer in things that have a long history.
Yeah.
It's not because it's a natural state. It's just because it's time proven. It has,
there's a record, no? There's a record of it. Yeah. That is definitely. No, I mean, it's because we're already like 40 minutes or so, and there are many more topics we wanted to discuss. Let's talk about meat. Let's talk about meat a little. That is one of the things that we also thought it was, you have an interesting profile. The first question I think is quite simple. Can you explain why animal source foods are essential for achieving nutrient security? Especially maybe in certain populations more than others, but.
Right. So I think the word essential is a bit problematic, I think. So it's just that if you include animal source foods in your diet, and we can have dedicated guesses or discussions on how much is needed for the best result. But my point of view is that they make diets more robust if you include them. You can exclude them, and some people do that, but the more restrictive your diet becomes. So if you move on from being omnivore to vegetarian to, lacto-ovo-vegetarian or pesco-vegetarian, and you throw out different categories of animal source food and you end up being vegan. The more restrictive you make it, the less robust your diet will be. And that will depend then on, your nutritional skills, your body. How does your body deal with such a diet? It's different from person to person. Don't underestimate also that a lot of things need to be converted in the body, and not everybody has the same conversion efficiencies. So from carotenes carotenoids to vitamin A, for instance, or from the omega-3 fatty acids in oils to the longer chain omega-3 fatty acids that you find mostly in fatty fish and so forth. Those are conversion processes that differ from person to person. And so not everybody may do as well on those diets as compared to people that are more apt to do so. And so it depends on your metabolic identity. It depends on your nutritional wisdom. How good are you at combining different protein sources to end up with an acceptable amino acid profile? It will depend on availability, which kind of foods you have. And so it becomes more complicated. So animal source foods, just make it easier to get to more robust diets. So if in our paper we are using two dimensions, one is, processing, and that's where we use it mostly to be careful about ultra processed foods, where we acknowledge the value of processed foods. And the other dimension is nutrient density. Now you do have nutrient dense plant foods and animal foods, but because of the trophic level, animal foods end up being among the most nutrient dense ones. And some plant foods are great options as well, like dark leafy vegetables, for instance. They're fantastically nutrient dense. And nutrient density in this case refers especially to the priority micronutrients, the ones that are already limiting in global diets.
Yeah.
Those we don't have to look at the whole batch of, all vitamins and minerals, but especially at those that are already extremely difficult to get. Some of them are hard to get from plants. They're not easy to obtain from plants. I'm not even talking about B12.
The vitamin D as well, no, is difficult from plants, as far as I know.
Sorry?
Vitamin D as well is difficult.
Vitamin D is a difficult one for anyone, I think. That's probably the only micronutrient that I'm supplementing myself personally, because it's just a very hard one to get from food. You get it in certain fatty fish, and so, but it's not an easy one.
Yeah.
So, but there's that's the story around iron and heme iron. There's a story on zinc. If you have, it also depends how you make up your plant diet. If you have lots of cereals inside, that will interfere with bioavailability because of the anti-nutritional factors that are inside. So it's kind of complicating things a lot.
Well, what is, because you're, I think, one of the persons that got involved in it. I wanted to ask you if you could explain to the audience but they do not know, what is the Dublin Declaration and the Denver Call to Action?
Right. So the Dublin Declaration is something we set up 2 years ago, when we organized a conference in Dublin to look at the place of meat and maybe to some extent also other animal source foods in society. A declaration was published that says that we have to be very careful if we're gonna vilify those foods too much. Now, it's not saying that we should, either increase it or everybody should eat it, but it's just a warning against over vilifying those foods because they are valuable. It's stating that animals have a place in the food system, and it doesn't take any position in how many animals that should be or how you should manage those herds. Those are complicated discussions that we leave to the individual opinion of every scientist. But it does say that it would be dangerous to take out animals from the system in a very radical move. It's certainly arguing for transformation and change, but it's also warning against too harsh accusations of either animal source foods or livestock. The Denver Call for Action 2 years later builds on that, saying that if we essentially it's more of an urgency. It's more like, so now that we have 1,200 or something scientists that have put their name on the declaration, now about 45 senior scientists are stepping up and saying, look, now we should take this more seriously as well. Because the unintended consequences of some of the radical proposals could be very severe.
But what is the threatening that you actually perceive from,
So say again, sorry?
The threat that you actually perceive from these measurements that are taken, that a little bit that Dublin Declaration goes like.
So the question is, what are we arguing against? Like examples
yes, it's a threat that
It will happen when you...
is all the animals will, there is an actual threat of animals disappearing from the food system.
Yeah.
Or there is a threat of reducing so much the meat. Yeah, I don't know. What is the perspective?
So the threat is that we would further compromise nutrient security in very dramatic changes towards, very plant-based diets. I remember that I started out by talking about my master thesis at the time, which was looking at nutrient security in Burundi. This is where I first learned how important animal source foods are for food security. That was the exact topic of the thesis. How you could see that families that had access to those foods were much better off, nutritionally speaking, than others. That's of course the context of the global South, right? It's but that's an important part of the conversation, especially if we talk about planetary health diets, planetary approaches to diet. So I think it's very important for food and nutrient security that we are careful if we have radical changes in diets. And secondly, if we take out from an environmental point of view, and of course, it's perfectly acknowledged that lots of things are problematic about the way that animal production is taking place today. But that also goes for a lot of what's happening in the plant space. I think the binary binary division is not a very productive one. It should be evaluated more as a combined set of, elements that you try to harmonize and play out. And using certain criteria to explore when you're trespassing or going beyond certain red lines. And so if you would take out the animals, you would run into a problem with lots of different things, like, this the aspect of circularity, which is important. If you produce plants, it comes with a lot of bulk that is not edible. There's something has to be done with that, and animals are great to upcycle those things. It has to do with what ruminants can achieve for management of grasslands, and the way that can, if it's well performed. And again, this is it's a word that carries a lot of weight here, the if, but if it's well performed, it can improve biodiversity. It can improve carbon sequestration, water retention. So if you contribute to soil health, I think you can do great things with ruminants. And if you would just unplug the animals from that environmental system, a lot of things would collapse from the environmental side of things. But also, societally speaking, animals are extremely important for livelihoods and for the management of rural communities and for the maintenance of rural communities. They are the backbone of certain, traditional communities throughout the globe. There's an FAO report that specifically looks how animals are sometimes the only way to achieve some capital for women in the global South.
Yeah, but that's also because we value it that much. Like, if we will change it drastically, you will value plants more, you will get the same effect on the other side.
Society-wise, yes.
Society-wise.
Yes,
the thing is what I also...
Yes and no, but it's also how, if you think what you can do from a labor point of view, and the way that it's set up with respect to land use and the labor that is needed on the fields and the role and the traditional roles of gender related roles. And of course, you're right, that's a cultural thing. Keeping some animals is for now one of the options that people can have in such countries to generate some livelihoods.
Yeah, no, because indeed the system is made for it. Yeah, that is the thing. So, like, I hear a lot of things like what I have questions about, because, like the World Health Organization drastically said processed meat can be carcinogenic. In a
processed meat.
Yeah, processed meats.
Yeah,
so we always...
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead first. I'll answer that.
Yeah, but then, like, it's, classified processed meats, of course, as carcinogenic, and red meat as group 2A, so it's also probably carcinogenic. But then that is done on the health part where I have questions, and where I have a question. But then on the other side is the sustainability part, because, like, I see the value of animals within regenerative agriculture and how to use that with fertilizing ground, etc., etc. But in the current system, most of the animals do destroy they have the most effect on our planet. Like, in the current system, it destroys many more, because nowadays we have meat that is so cheap and it's not very that the cost in meat mainly is not like covering all the, let's say, sustainability effects. So it needs a drastically other form, right? How we produce meat and how we also consume meat.
Yes. No, I agree with that. But just maybe let me get back to the WHO thing first, because it's something that is often mentioned. And I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding there as well. So what WHO through its IARC panel did at some point in time is making a hazard classification. And IARC classifies lots of things in that hazard classification. Like even sunlight, is a hazard. And then of course, okay, we know that we don't have to expose ourselves to harsh sunlight, right? Because it's dangerous. But we also know that the sun is very valuable because it brings you vitamin D. We talked about vitamin D before. So it's something that can cut both ways. And a hazard is what you could call a danger, but it doesn't tell you anything about risk. Now, if you want to go from hazard to risk, you need a risk assessment. And that's not what the WHO IARC panel has done. They came up with a hazard classification. The risk assessment is something that takes into account context. That's hence the sun, depends how you deal with the sun. Nobody tells you that, not even WHO or IARC, that you have to avoid the sun. Well, on the contrary. And there's information from Sweden that shows you that sun avoidance correlates with higher mortality, probably because of vitamin D. So what matters is how that hazard is integrated in a certain context. We have information that if you integrate red meat, and processed meat is a difficult story because that's first of all a very mixed bag of all sorts of different foods, and some of them probably are not all that good for you. But for unprocessed red meat, we know that if you look at associations, even in a Western context, that if they're part of healthy background diets, that those associations either inverse or disappear. And they're mostly found when you have an unhealthy background diet. There's a study, for instance, in Alberta, Canada, that shows that very neatly, where those people that eat lots of fruits and vegetables see it's a non-significant, but it tends to be a protective association with more red meat. People that eat little fruits and vegetables, they see an increased risk with the more meat they consume. So and we don't know if it's because of the fruits and vegetables as such, or just again because of the confounding that people that eat more fruits and vegetables will bring because of their general lifestyles. But the risk assessment is extremely important in that conversation.
Yeah, definitely. And then on the sustainability part,
and then that absolutely. I mean, the way certain production systems are made now are very problematic, especially I think with respect to eutrophication and pollution of waterways. That's one where clearly a lot can be done. We do have to think of feed-food competition in certain ways. So all of those problems and deforestation is another big issue. Pressure on natural resources because of the expansion of land use for feed. So those things, yes, they come with problems. But we also have eutrophication for certain plant systems. We have it for the expansion also, of land use also comes for certain crops, and it will be amplified if we take out the animal foods. So then you have to balance those things and see how much can we change in that food system so that we optimize this to a certain degree.
Why is it going to be amplified then? Is it mainly because
you're going to need more food to compensate for the nutrition you're losing from the animal foods.
Yeah.
So whatever you're taking out has to be compensated for. You have that, for instance, also with greenhouse gas emissions. The latest number from FAO's clean model is that we have 12% of global emissions coming from livestock, right? That's the contribution of livestock. That 12% will not just disappear if we take out animal source foods, right? Because you will have to make more plant foods, and then you will have a number that is smaller. So any change you're going to make, and that's something we shouldn't forget, that if we change something else has to come in its place. And there's certain margin for change, clearly, but a radical change where you just take out everything and you just assume that you'll be able to compensate that by growing more crops is something we have to really carefully evaluate before we make strong moves here. because
you were
it may not
mentioning,
be
no,
as
it's just a
straightforward
matter
as
of the
we think.
feed versus the food. No, because at the same time, there's a lot of land that is already being used to make feed for
70%, I think.
for cows and for animals that in the end they need much more food than actually what humans need to consume in order to grow. So that creates a little bit of, yes, of course we will need more land to grow food for humans, but at the same time we would need much less land to grow food for.
Feed food competition is a thing. But again, it needs the nuances because, okay, a lot of that land is not able to grow edible foods for human, or it will grow lower quality foods that are not entering the food chain.
That's possible.
The way those things are compared is very often based on calories.
Yeah.
Because they say, it's so much, so you will save some, animals bring in only so many calories and only so much protein. But we need the full nutritional assessment here. We need to see the whole package. You don't eat animal source foods for the calories. You drink oil for calories, or you eat sugar for calories. You don't eat animal source foods for calories. And that's very commonly the denominator that they are using to compare those scenarios. So that discussion needs to be, we need to have that discussion, but it needs to be done with the proper metrics. I think my stance in the environmental debate is one pro change, but also one where I'm insisting very much on using the appropriate metrics and not having a certain tunnel vision on one specific metric. So a holistic use of different metrics and understanding very well what we're comparing and anticipating what the change will look like if we have a radical change. So it's mostly a call for humility and for cautiousness if we're going to have radical changes.
What is your vision about the current consumption of meat in Western societies? Do you think it's too much, or do you think that maybe just a little much? Maybe you think it's too little. I don't think you will think it's too little, but put that option there.
Well, it depends from which perspective. Again, if it's for health, and that's sometimes a clashing perspective, right? It's for health, it's a very benign food, or it's something.
But the current levels of consumption right now are, would you say, appropriate?
I think I have difficulties in finding an advisable amount because I think that's something very difficult to calculate. So the way from a policy perspective, the way I would see it is that we start bringing in change based on certain harmful outputs and, putting red lines on the checkboard or on the playfield and move everything in that domain. And that will come with changes in production and therefore in consumption. I cannot predict how much that will be, but most likely it will be less, yes. But how much less, I have absolutely no idea.
Yeah, I get it.
I think those modeling exercises are very, very difficult to perform.
That's true. Let's ask something else.
No, but maybe later you can.
I have two questions actually. Well, the first one is, what is your perception of the growth of the alternative proteins? And I'm interested, what would be your opinion, for example, of initiatives like cultured meat?
So there are many. First of all, if you don't want to have meat, there are options, right? You don't.
I agree.
There are many options. You can be a certain type of vegetarian and still have a very nutrient-dense diet. Then you have the option, and that's through wholesome food approaches. Okay. And then you have the option of bringing in the so-called alternatives. The problem there is that you usually end up with something that doesn't look all that attractive from a composition perspective. We're talking about protein isolates and then they are mixed with some kind of refined oil. They're emulsified and texturized, and then you have an ultra-processed food. I'm not in favor of that personally. Then you have, what else you have? You have lab meat. And I think and that would be a different story because that's muscle, right? It's not.
That will be like meat.
It would be like meat. Okay.
Grown in a lab. Probably you cannot talk out in the same ways of nutrient density because
it gets much closer. It's a much closer, it would be a more wholesome, nutritionally more comparable alternative for meat. The problem there is that we're not really anywhere with this thing. We have some niche product that is produced in Singapore, which is chicken nugget, which is first of all, not only lab meat, but it's mixed with all sorts of other things. And it's very, very small production level. So, and we've been claiming that this will be produced on larger scale, but it hasn't happened. And I don't honestly see it happening in the foreseeable future. The reason for that is that those production processes are very delicate, right? It's bioreactor work. And I've worked with bioreactors in the past quite a bit, especially for the microbiology. Bioreactors, especially for those kind of cultures, which are very prone to problems, they need very, very careful conditions, almost pharma grade conditions.
Yeah.
And you can do
Indeed.
this. And it has been done, actually. I mean, we have produced lab meat, but just in very small quantities. If you want to have bulk production, it's very hard to combine pharma grade production setups with specialized materials, which probably are also quite energy intense. And then you would have to produce bulk levels for global production that would push out the conventional meat. I personally don't see that happening. Now, time will tell, but I don't think that will be a very realistic scenario in the next, at least not in the next decade.
So then we come on a very, critical point, actually, because the movement is we actually have to reduce meat consumption because of environmental impact, because the current system on creating most of the meat is damaging more, and that is something that needs to be changed slightly. That needs to be changed. Then you have the undernourishment, which meat can play a role in to nourish the person. And then the solutions that are coming up for meat replacers are not yet as promised looking, right? So then how does the future look like in your eyes, Frédéric? Because in the end, we have to compromise in that sense. We have to find a balance again, right? Because the planet is unbalanced, the human health is unbalanced.
Well, yes. So coming back to that nourishment approach from our model is that we leave the flexibility in the model. So people that are concerned about footprints and so on can move to solutions that are coming with certain decreases in footprints, but by keeping the possibilities open. Again, suppose you want to take out red meat. So that model offers you solutions to get there without necessarily having to go in the ultra processed food category. So the more restrictive you'll make it, the more difficult it will become again, but you can be greatly nourished by following a lacto-ovo vegetarian diet, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big health longevity persons in the world, the famous one, Brian Johnson, is fully focusing on a vegan diet.
Yeah, well, but yes, okay, that's not really something that I would extrapolate to population.
No, but it's for sure that it happens that in societies that in theory consume much less, for example, beef than Western societies. You still have people that age to 80, 90, talking about overall Eastern societies in Southeast Asia. They still eat meat, mostly in the form of chicken and pork. But yeah, they still have healthy, lifestyles with different approaches. Because what you were talking, Frédéric, there is not a single approach to what is a healthy, diet.
No, but you will need your nutrient-rich foods, right? That's what you will need for sure. And then, and so the way to get there is by, as the confused omnivores that we are, the way to get there is it's difficult to start from scratch, right? You go to a supermarket and you have no guidance. Well, I think that's where traditional diets come in. Again, not wanting to be here, not to have the logical fallacy of because it's traditional, it's good, because all traditions at some points also evolved from something that also for some innovation in the past. But traditional diets, again, give you lots of inspiration. And the more you step out of your local traditional diet and the more you look around, the more of solutions you'll be able to find. I don't want to set the ambition bar so low that I say that we can just drop out all the animal source foods and live from factory foods to solve the problem. I think it can perfectly be done by using wholesome foods.
And if there is one thing that you would like to give our listeners away and towards improving our food system, what would it be?
Well, my insistence is really on the ultra processed foods part of things. I think those foods come with, there's hardly anything positive about it. They tend to be destructive for the environment. because they're monoculture based, they tend to be destructive for health. They tend to lead to overconsumption. So with respect also to, amplifying the whole problem by just having higher consumption levels. So if we just could drastically shrink those, that would be a big step forward, I think.
Well, then I think we enter in our closing round of questions. Is just two quick questions, hopefully. One depends on you, because the one thing that we do at the end, we have made you a lot of questions. Hopefully it's been a nice discussion for you, but what we always do is that you have to make a question to us. And we will try to respond in our best way.
Well, that's, if you think back of the food you were eating as a kid, when you grew up, and sometimes those come with kind of emotional overtones, right? How much do those foods play a role today in your lives? Are they in the realm of legends, or are you still embracing them as regular foods? Like the ones that marked your infancy, like the ones that you really have strong memories about. Where are they today in your actual lives?
Well, for me, it changed drastically but that is also because there are two cultures now intertwined, because I have a relationship with a Spanish person. So then the incorporation of olive oil came, and that's not, I can't get it out of my diet currently. So
I missed it. Say again.
now there's olive oil, I have a very...
Once you try, there's no way back. Yeah?
It's now a very centralized place in my, it's a legend, I can say. Now, I can just not remove it. And previously it wasn't the case. I mean...
But what about hagelslag in your... No? In my case, I would say my breakfast always has to be a toast with olive oil. That is what I've been having breakfast since I was a kid. I believe that there are dishes that I try to do myself, like the paella or lentil soup in the Spanish way, where I still try to incorporate the chorizo. I also try to be creative in the ways where I can find ways to do it in a plant-based, just because I believe that I try to reduce the amount of meat. So sometimes I want to get back to that without having to add meat. But sometimes I also do it. But I believe that there are certain things that from when I was little that I used to adore that I do not eat them anymore. Like, I don't know, I don't eat so many French fries anymore. And I used to love them. Or pizza. I would eat pizza every Friday when it was a supermarket pizza. It was not like a homemade pizza. And now it's something that I would not even think of. Not because I don't like pizza, but I think I have different standards with things.
Right. Changed it a lot, also because of the information over time that you...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I also become more mindful about food. But yeah, there are some things that I try to keep in, and there are also things that with getting knowledge...
Salt and pepper.
Salt and pepper is still there.
Changed.
So yeah, I would say those things. But well, talking about, I think that your question is really related to our legendary ultimate question. That is normally,
okay,
what is your favorite food or dish, Frédéric?
It's a hard one.
Context.
I wouldn't even know, honestly speaking.
What is your favorite food or dish today?
No, you can actually ask him the question. Like, from your childhood, what is still something that is in your top 3? Or not?
I grew up at the Belgian coast side.
Mm-hmm.
And I think codfish is still big.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, and it's hard to find here in Brussels to have, fresh codfish that is of the quality that I remember as a kid.
Yeah,
so
it's probably all imported from different places.
In Spain, the fresh fish of Spain, you find it in Madrid, actually, because when they cut it, they directly bring it to the market in Madrid.
Oh, Spain has the greatest markets.
Yeah, I can tell. No, but there's a really famous in Madrid. One of the typical sandwiches to eat is the squid. No, the calamares, bocata de calamares, and it's because the best quality fish and seafood normally is in Madrid, which is a little bit weird because Madrid does not even have a coast. It's in the middle of the country, right. But it's just that they import the best seafood.
I don't think it's the problem is not the logistic problem. I think it's just the main problem is that there's just probably no market demand for it all that much here in Brussels anymore. People are now used to the uniform choice of salmon and maybe a few others, which is, by the way, remarkable that at the time when I was a kid, salmon was the one that was the most expensive version for the special festivities, and codfish was the ordinary one.
I also think about it sometimes. Like when I go to the supermarket, it's like salmon now is really normal. But when I was younger, you wouldn't see so much salmon around. It was more like a delicacy thing. Well, Frédéric, thanks a lot for the time that you spent. I think the conversation has been really great. Overall, first, because of the reflection of the dietary guidelines, is something that we for sure have not ever touched in this podcast. And I think it's something really interesting because people tend to just give like, yeah, they are there. They never question them. They never like really think about who are or how these dietary guidelines are stated. So I believe that is an interesting reflection. And also for the side of, joining here for a discussion about the role of meat, it's overall because we believe that discussions are really important. It's important to bring two sides and to confront them and to see like what are the arguments and what are the things that need to be rethought, because I believe you gave me the insight about the arable land and actually if it's good quality for the human consumption, that I never thought about it. And I think it's those things that actually what could get us helper to a better food system. And in the end, conversations are important, are actually one of the best things of being a human. This fact of being able to reason and to talk and to just really greatly try to come up with solutions. So really thank you for all that nice information and also for the great conversation. Thanks a lot for.
Well, I maybe as a last point, I absolutely agree that these conversations are very, very crucial. And the situation is so polarized. For instance, with respect to this Dublin Declaration, the only conversations or engagement, or almost the only engagement we are getting, is accusations of conflicts of interest. It's like, because those scientists, they have conflicts of interest with the meat industry. But we never really get into a constructive dialogue. And that's a shame. And I think we have to get to the bottom of some of those issues to see, what the best way forward is. I'm not invested in any specific,
Would you like to sit around the table? We maybe can do an organized roundtable session for that.
Yes, if you have somebody that is, but I need to have a constructive person in front of me, right? Because I've sometimes a lot of aggression.
I come up with an open mind. Those names will be, I don't know how the conversation will be viral, but if constructive.
If you listen to this episode and you think you are constructive, would like, please let us know.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well,
all right.
Thanks for your time, Frédéric.